Hello, everyone. It's a very wet and rainy day here in Washington, D.C., so I hope you're having better weather wherever you're listening in from. Thank you for joining us for this APA webinar on adapting your research methods in response to COVID-19. My name is Peggy Christidis. I'm a Science Program Officer in the Science Director of APA, and I will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. As many of you already know, this webinar is part of a series we've been doing since March called Staying on Track During a Pandemic. Today's webinar is, I believe, the 10th one in the series, and we've continued doing these webinars because the demand for them has been pretty high. So we thank you all for showing an interest in them, and as long as there's a demand, we'll continue doing them for you. Today we have four amazing and accomplished individuals who make up our panel today. But before I introduce them, I just want to go over a few things real quick. If at any time you get disconnected from the webinar, just try clicking again on the link you received when you first registered, and that should log you right back in. Many of you sent in questions ahead of time when you registered, so our panel will try to get through as many of those questions as time will allow. You also have an opportunity to type in a question as the webinar is taking place in real time. The GoToWebinar control panel has a questions tab that you can type your question into. And if time permits, we'll try to get to some of those questions as well. The slides you'll be seeing today will be shared with our audience in PDF format. You'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that will have a link to these slides, and you can download them. The webinar is also being recorded, and that will be available soon on our Staying on Track homepage. And I'll have a link to that webpage on the very last slide. This webinar will also be transcribed, and that transcription will appear on the Staying on Track homepage as well. In addition, we'll be sending you a short post-webinar survey. So if you can, please take a moment to fill that out. It's always helpful to get feedback from our audience. Okay, so with all of that in order, let's begin. So we've all been experiencing this very extended period of lockdown and closures because of COVID-19. And of course, many of us have seen our academic institutions close down as well. And unfortunately, it's not even clear if they're going to open up at all this year. And as such, many labs have had to shut down either partially or completely and temporarily suspend their research efforts. But what we're seeing now is a glimmer of hope with labs slowly reopening and research starting up again. But the way we conducted research prior to COVID-19 may not be doable or appropriate in this new world we live in, and researchers have had to make adaptations to their methods in order to get their projects back on track. Today's panelists will discuss what it's been like for them to conduct research in today's world. They will describe how they were able to successfully recover from potential delays and lab closures by making some changes to their research protocols. They will also talk about how it's important to take into account stressors that a pandemic might have on research participants. And they will share with us some creative and effective ways to get back to data collection. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel for today's webinar. First, we have Dr. Kimberly Balsam. Dr. Balsam is a psychology professor and chair of her department at Palo Alto University. She is the director of the LGBTQ area of emphasis. She is also director of the Center for LGBTQ Evidence-Based Applied Research. Dr. Balsam runs the RISE Lab, which focuses on conducting empirical research to advance our knowledge of the psychology of diverse sexual and gender minority people. And she is also past president of Division 44, which is the Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. Second, we have Mary Fernandez. Ms. Fernandez is a clinical neuropsychology PhD candidate at Georgia State University. She is the 2020 chair-elect for the American Psychological Association of Graduate Students, or as many of us know it, APAGS. Mary is also a Brain and Behavior Fellow and an NSF Graduate Research Fellow. Our third panelist is Dr. Teresa Ober. Dr. Ober is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Notre Dame. She's part of the Learning Analytics and Measurement in Behavioral Science Lab, also known as LAMS for short. And this lab is interested in measurement issues in psychological assessment and educational testing, and specializes in item response theory and its application to large-scale testing programs. Finally, we have Dr. Bridget Callahan. She's an assistant professor of psychology at UCLA. Dr. Callahan is the director of the Brain and Body Lab, which studies interactions between mental and physical health across development. She's going to be a little late coming into the webinar, so hopefully she'll be able to log in and present as our last panelist. If we experience any type of difficulty getting her in, we will at least have her slides available for you to review, but hopefully she'll be able to get in. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the webinar. Thank you for being here. So we're going to begin with Dr. Balsam, and I'm going to just load up your slides.
Okay.
And whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see such a good turnout for this. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my experiences and also hearing about what the other panelists have been doing. So I'm going to talk some about how do we adapt our research during the pandemic and really during everything that's going on right now. So I'll talk a little bit about some tools, some strategies, and how I'm viewing this as having some opportunities for us as researchers. Next slide. Okay, so 2020 has kind of not gone exactly how I think any of us envisioned it going. And I mean, there's really a lot going on. So I want to really emphasize the pandemic, but also all of the issues with racial injustice that are coming into the public eye more, but are long-standing problems in our society that we're sort of reckoning with and being faced with how can we come up with some new solutions here? And so it's really in the context of that, as well as all of the economic inequalities that have come to light during the pandemic, and gaps have widened, all kinds of injustices, that we're charged with keeping calm and collecting data, which sometimes seems almost like an absurd thing to try to do with everything that's going on. And yet, this is, these are our tools as psychological researchers, right? This is what we're supposed to do. And for those of you, I know that many of the people on this webinar are either, undergraduate students or graduate students or early career professionals. And so there's this idea that you want to keep your degree program on track and keep your career on track. And to do that, you have to collect data. So hopefully we can talk about some new ways of thinking about that will be useful. Next slide. So I think, 2020 has not gone how we planned for it to go. And we're really in a situation of national and international crisis. But I think we know as psychologists that within every crisis, there are opportunities. And so I think we have some choice in how we can view this disruption to our research plans and think about what we can create out of the wake of what we thought we were going to create. Next slide. So first things first, I want to talk about some tools that we all have at our disposal. These are things in these boxes that we know from psychological research make us healthier human beings, and they also make us better researchers. And so just kind of reminding ourselves that we can be flexible, be kind to ourselves, use tools of mindfulness, trying to stay present, being creative, being willing to think creatively out of the box, and also being culturally responsive to the world around us, to populations around us that are experiencing marginalization, violence. All of these things can help us grow and become better researchers at this time. These are really our foundation. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that there is a transformative potential right now of research. And I put a picture of Bell Hooks's book from I think it's from the 1990s, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center here, because first of all, Bell Hooks, if you're not familiar with her, look her up, one of the 4 mothers of intersectionality. And, you know, the idea of this, that we can start to center people and voices and experiences that have been on the margins, that's really what I'm viewing as part of the opportunity here in this time, to start thinking about what can we do with our research to contribute to being a part of the solution for what's going on for us nationally, internationally. Next slide. So this is a picture of my lab. Feel free to look us up. I put the URL there. And in my lab, we focus on LGBTQ plus sexual and gender minority populations, and really take an intersectional perspective. So really look at especially LGBTQ plus people of color and people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds intersecting with sexual and gender identity experiences. So feel free to look us up. We also have copies of a number of the measures that we've developed over the years on there. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk about first is what my experience has been in my lab since March, and then I'll try to extract out some lessons learned that might be helpful to other people. So one of the things that was probably most meaningful and, you know, also most stressful, but I think ultimately most rewarding, was developing the study I have listed as number 1, which is we did a cross-sectional survey of almost 1,000 people during April of 2020. So I had the idea for this study on March 27th. I went to the IRB and they said they would do a really rapid turnaround, and the study launched on April 1st. So that's really a world record for conceptualizing and implementing a study. And then we collected data only in April. And I think what was exciting about that was really responding in a really time-sensitive way to some of the things we saw going on in LGBTQ communities at the time. And we asked quantitative and qualitative questions, and we got an enormous response because I think it just really struck a nerve with people that they felt like responding. Also, Gender Kaleidoscope was a longitudinal study. And so this is something else to think about. If you have a panel of people that you've been following over time, if you have the ability to do so, now's a great time to follow up with them. So we had recruited this large sample of LGBTQ folks and surveyed them in October, November. And the plan was to do an annual follow-up survey, and we had gotten their consent to recontact them next fall. And, you know, it's not like any of us had a lot of free time on our hands, but we just thought this is too good of an opportunity to pass up, to really see in an empirical sense, how is the pandemic affecting people's stress, mental health, how they're thinking about their lives, and especially how it's affecting them as LGBTQ people. So in May, we did another quick turnaround to IRB and followed up with our panel. The numbers 3 and 4 on this slide are both projects that data collection was already in process. And so that may be the case for some of you, that you're kind of in the middle of doing something and then COVID hit and everybody's lives changed. So with the first one, the NB project, we were in the middle of doing some focus group data collection. Fortunately, we were already doing it online, but one of the focus groups occurred in mid-March. So it was in a different historical period than the ones that were done in January and February. With the Latinx Resilience Study, we were in the middle of conducting this large survey in both English and Spanish with LGBTQ folks, looking at some of the similar constructs as the NB project. And we noticed that recruitment really stalled out because I think people were so impacted by the pandemic that they, you know, this survey didn't seem relevant. So in that case, we actually went back to the IRB and did a brief modification to add some COVID related questions to make it seem more relevant. Next slide. The other thing that's going on in my lab, though, is that we have several projects that are in process that are supposed to be launching or are going to be launching later this year. And we're having to really rethink how we're doing those. So The first two involve some kind of intervention component. The first study is an intervention for middle school youth that was going to be done in the context of going into local after-school programs and meeting with youth and having them do this web-based program. And we had that all set up. Well, the after-school program isn't happening, so I don't think we're doing that. So really what we're having to reconceptualize is to have it be done, you know, at home, not necessarily confined to youth who go to a particular school. And we're also thinking about how are we going to market this then to parents? You know, your student is doing distance learning. Here's another thing they can do. So even just rethinking about how we're shaping getting participants for that. And then the Clinical Academy was supposed to be an in-depth, in-person training experience for clinicians that was going to meet once a month for an entire day. So we've had to reconceptualize that to be online, and we have to reconceptualize how we're doing the training, because what we were going to do in person isn't really going to work. We know that online pedagogy, it's not a good practice to have people sitting there for 8 hours at a time. So we're having to rethink about that too. And then finally, the PRISM survey is going to be a survey. It's ready to launch online, looking at constructs that are all really impacted by the pandemic in lots of different ways. I mean, one of the main variables we're going to look at is mindfulness and how people use mindfulness, and mindfulness as a resilience factor. Well, a lot of people that weren't doing mindfulness practices before are doing it now. So we're concerned there's going to be, you know, either a ceiling or floor effect on a lot of these things. And so we're adding some new items to kind of make it more relevant. And we also delayed the launch because we thought that launching in the spring, we were just in too much of an acute crisis for this survey to really be generalizable or meaningful. Next slide. So that's sort of where we're at in my RISE lab. I'll talk now about a few specific strategies, and then I'm happy to answer questions later on. Next slide. So one is thinking about qualitative data collection. I know that was one of the questions that was posed to us as presenters. And you really can do focus groups or interviews for that matter online. And we experimented with doing video-based and text-based focus groups, which, you know, at first I'm kind of old school, and to me focus groups meant literally sitting around a table and serving food to people. So I couldn't believe that we could do it text-based, but we could. And it actually ends up being more accessible and inclusive to people with, you know, a range of different identities and experiences when you open it up this way. But some challenges to be aware of is just monitoring the flow of conversation, you know, knowing when somebody's done talking or if they don't have anything else to say. You have to set up systems for that. You also really have to think about privacy concerns because, you know, a lot of people live with other people, they live in tight spaces, and they may not necessarily have the privacy to be participating in the focus group. So that's something else to negotiate with your participants in advance. And then definitely technical difficulties. Make sure you have somebody on hand that can help you with that so that doesn't disrupt your flow. Next slide. So if you're doing intervention research, I think this is the challenging one, especially if it was supposed to be something in person, as we had with a couple of our different studies. And so I think you have to take a step back and think about, can it be adapted for online or social distancing? And, you know, if so, how does that change the scientific questions that you're trying to answer with this study? And also think about, is there a way to really leverage the current events to enhance the project, either to enhance recruitment or enhance what you're trying to do with the project? An example of that is us marketing this to parents who are, you know, pulling their hair out, wondering, how am I going to keep my school-age kids occupied? Well, you know, here we have an intervention they can participate in. Next slide. Another thing to think about is your measures. So this is always a big question in empirical research. You know, how much do you adapt measures that have established psychometric properties for a particular population or situation? And a couple things I've thought about in adapting measures, you know, to administer during the pandemic is, I think on the one hand, by adapting and adding in questions that are relevant to the current situation, it allows us to collect empirical information about what's going on for participants. But it also does another thing, which is it helps participants feel validated. So even if questions about COVID-19, for example, aren't really central to your research question, I think if you kind of give a head nod to that in your research, if you include some questions about it, it helps participants gain trust in you as a research team and make you seem more like you're tapped into what's going on for them. So I think there's really those two things to consider. Next slide. So some sample items that we've put in a couple of the studies that we've done so far is, we made up some additional employment questions asking about, and I think the way that we got some of these prompts is just reading the newspapers at the end of March about the types of experiences that people were having with work under the pandemic. This is some, but not all of the prompts that we had about getting furloughed or fewer hours or not getting paid on time. And then we made up this qualitative question in our survey, which ended up yielding such rich data that I've now presented at it at an international conference, and it's just about ready to be submitted for publication in the next week or so. People had a lot to say about that. So I would definitely encourage adding something like that in, even if you're doing a survey that's mostly quantitative. Next slide. One of the questions for us as presenters was about participant recruitment, which is always a big thing to think about. It's always a big thing that students are thinking about. I think, especially when you're studying, as I do, populations that are marginalized and sometimes hidden and sometimes have a history with researchers, not being trustworthy. You have a lot of barriers to overcome. I think right now, if we think about participants' motivation at the moment, they might have more time on their hands or they might have less. So that's going to really depend on what population you're trying to sample from. They may also be motivated, though, to share their perspectives both on the pandemic and on racial injustice and what's going on in our country right now. In terms of compensation, you need to think about that. Like, a lot of people have seen either, a reduction in pay or they're out of work, and they may really need compensation for being in your research, but you may not have it, especially if this is a study you developed rapidly, or if there are other, budget cuts at your university or from your funders. But I think we do need to take all of that into account and thinking about, we don't want to overburden marginalized groups by over surveying them right now. So you have to really think about what's the purpose of your research, and are you asking people questions just to get something else on your CV, or how are you going to give back to these marginalized communities that you're sampling from? And then I think in terms of your advertising, how this comes together is just really making sure that the way you're explaining your study shows that you are culturally responsive and you are responsive to the social context. And be mindful of your web presence as well, whether that's on social media or on your lab's webpage or any other places that you have a web presence. Because since people are participating online, you're just a click away and they're going to be looking you up and trying to figure out who are these people. Next slide. Just some other suggestions. I think that thinking about your own identities and your own experiences in light of the pandemic, in light of the racial injustice issues that are so prominent in 2020, that positionality is going to inform every stage of your research. And just as an example, when we were looking at our qualitative COVID-19 research, we all had different identities that we brought to the table within our team. And also we noticed that over time, as the pandemic situation evolved, we were interpreting the data from April like through the eyes of people in May or June, which was a quite different situation than April was. So you have to always be thinking on all those different levels about what you're bringing to the table as a researcher and how it's shaping your interpretation. It's a great opportunity right now to collaborate with other people since we're all interacting online anyways, form collaborations. I've done lots of research with people at other institutions over the years, and sometimes you can get some really fruitful and important work done that way. So I really encourage collaborations. Stay tuned and stay informed about current events because your research questions are going to change, your research context is going to change. And then always make sure that whatever you do, you interpret it in the social context in which you collected the data, right? Nothing that we do in 2020 is, that discussion section is always going to have to include a discussion of what was going on in 2020. And so I guess my final thoughts on the next slide are about, are we trying to stay on track, or are we like reinventing the track and creating a new track? And I would really argue that 2020 provides all of us as psychological researchers with the opportunity to rethink how we do research and get more creative about that process, but also our role as psychological researchers and what we have to contribute within social and historical contexts. So I think that is all I have to say. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. That was very informative. Great talk. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mary Fernandez. So, Ms. Fernandez, I have your slides up, and whenever you're ready, please begin.
Sounds good. Thank you, Peggy. So there's going to be considerable overlap between what I'm going to share today and what Dr. Baltzan just shared. So I'll be pretty brief. I think it's nice for us to have an opportunity to answer questions at the end too. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so just for a quick overview or context of why I'm here and how the pandemic has affected my research. I am a 5th-year doctoral student at Georgia State University, and I was in the process of actually beginning my data collection for my dissertation when the pandemic hit. So I received IRB approval for my originally planned project on March 5th. I was also out of town that weekend, and that was the last time I traveled. And I got an email from the IRB saying your paperwork has been approved, and let us know if you have any questions. So I started recruiting and scheduling participants almost immediately as soon as I got back into Atlanta from being out of town. And then about a week later, on March 16th, everything sort of hit the fan. So Emory and GSU, where I'm based out of, both closed. Both of our clinics closed almost immediately. And at that point, for at least a couple of weeks, we were still not entirely sure of what to expect. There was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know if this would be temporary, if it would be a long-term shutdown. So for at least a few weeks, I functioned under the hope, perhaps, or the impression that this would end in a couple of months, and I would go back to my normal, originally planned data collection project after a couple of months. Fast forward to many months from then, and clearly we're still in a place of a lot of uncertainty, and many things have still not reopened for good reason. So in about mid-April, I started to really rethink what my project was. And as Dr. Baltzan said, I started to think of ways in which there was an opportunity to change what my original project was, to answer the same questions I found important, but to actually get more context around it, and to maybe even give back to my participants in a way that I might not have thought of before. So I went back to my dissertation committee and to other colleagues in my field and just asked for their input or their feedback on different alternatives to what I had planned. What I had planned was conducting in-person neuropsychological assessments on individuals with Cushing's disease. And Cushing's disease is a neuroendocrine disorder that results in excessive levels of cortisol. All of this is relevant because the pandemic has resulted in a lot of elevated stress. So there was definitely, there was a huge direct impact of the pandemic on my data collection and on my participant pool, my sample pool. So what we decided to do, and I will talk through some of my lessons learned too in the next couple of slides, but what we decided to do was to create a hybrid of in-person and computerized testing. As long as the pandemic is a risk to individuals, the entire study will be computerized or online. And that was something that my committee was very supportive of. So my dissertation itself will only include data that's been collected online. from that point, perhaps in the future, as part of a longitudinal part of the study, we will then go back to collecting in-person neuropsychological assessments, which then also gives us some idea or some perspective for how the online measures that we've been administering maps on to some already validated and well-established in-person tests. So we started to see some silver linings and some benefits to doing it this way. The other huge change that I made was I needed to include more surveys or questionnaires, like Dr. Balsam also mentioned, on how the pandemic is affecting my participant pool. These individuals who are already impacted by stress and are perhaps now facing more than just one or two barriers, you know, in addition to health concerns, also perhaps having economic concerns and other huge issues. So I needed to actually pay more attention to the cultural and social context in which everything was happening. So then we submitted this newly developed or slightly modified study to the IRB. And again, it was record speed turnaround time. This was with an amendment that needed to be added to. We got it back within a month. So there's definitely been a lot of speedy, I think, adaptations that have been made by universities and by a lot of different organizations to try and adapt to what's going on right now. And I think that's definitely been a surprise, but also a silver lining to how slowly IRB typically would run. And then on June 18th, I began my data collection. I have a very, very tiny update in that I am not even halfway there, but I think there are still a lot of benefits to doing it the way that I've been doing it. And I've been speaking to a lot of the participants too on the phone as I recruit, and they're just very grateful to be able to continue participating while knowing that this is not what was initially envisioned. Okay, next slide, please. So just a couple of considerations from my experience. First of all, for those of you who are neuropsychology trainees or interested in assessment, you might be struggling as well with figuring out ways to provide or to administer neuropsychological tests virtually. That is absolutely a struggle that our field is facing currently, and there have been a lot of creative solutions to this. The solution that I decided to go with eventually for my dissertation is a computerized platform called Test My Brain. It is a digitalized or digital and computerized testing platform that has been made free for practitioners and scientists during this time. So I highly recommend checking out that option if this is something that you're interested in. The battery of cognitive tests that are being administered currently through Test My Brain has been normed on over 2.5 million participants. So it's definitely a very useful resource. There are limitations, as there always are, including, you know, sensitivity to certain medical populations or validity concerns about how it maps onto well-established in-person tests. But there's also normative data that's available and has been validated on several of the tests that are basically analogs of the in-person. There's a coding, matrix reasoning, digit span subtest that is very similar to the WACE. Just to give you some context for what you're looking at with that resource. Another thing that you can do if you're interested in neuropsychological testing at this time is to follow ANST, which is the Association of Neuropsychology Student Trainees. And ANST has a lot of resources for student researchers in adapting their research and also clinical practice currently. So please use ANST, which is a part of Division 40 of APA, as a resource if you have questions about neuropsychology specifically. In terms of COVID and its relationship to stress and how that might be impacting your participants, since I'm studying Cushing's disease, I had the fortune of including a control group that's very well suited to understand the questions that I was interested in. So that might be an aspect that you can look into if you're studying a medical population or a group that has a suitable control group that you could look at. You also definitely want to include trauma or stress measures. There is a fantastic repository of COVID-related measures that I'm happy to share. At this point, there are very unique and validated COVID surveys, so we're not depending on surveys from past pandemics or past stressful events. The other thing that I did was I referenced past literature on similar large-scale traumatic events. So for example, I looked at how the scientific literature was impacted by 9/11 to try and see if we can use that as sort of a reference for what to expect in the coming months for participants who are engaging in our research. Again, it's not the same, but it does give us some idea for how we can help this very unique population participate in our study and cope while they're doing it. All right, next slide, please. In terms of data collection, I know we got a lot of questions about how to maximize data collection or how to make sure that you're getting as many participants as possible. A couple of ideas here. So first of all, my next slide will include a list of resources, but one of those is the APAGS discussion forum for COVID-19. It's a Facebook discussion forum. I encourage you all to join it. We had this discussion a long time ago, back in March and April, where students were worrying about their trajectory being impacted and how they could maximize data collection. And a lot of folks said they had success with things like Reddit, which might be a very creative way of garnering a pretty large population. So I definitely encourage you to follow that discussion forum and to post questions in there if you have any. We also, in terms of just being sensitive to the people who you're conducting your research with, as Dr. Balsam said, be sure to gauge interest, but to answer questions that they may have. They might have a lot of questions about how participating in this research might affect them, or how much time it might take, or just a lot of unique concerns that we might not have expected previously. So be patient, answer their questions. Definitely be ready to troubleshoot technical difficulties. I will say, in recruiting participants and in sending them online consent forms, I have pretty much been a technical troubleshooter for most of my conversations. So that includes, how do I open this PDF and sign it, and things like that. So just be ready for those kinds of hurdles to come up. Send follow-ups. Their participants have consistently been gracious and thankful for my sending follow-ups, because they just forget, or perhaps they got busy and things fell off their radar, and that's okay. None of them have been upset about it, but also be considerate. You don't want to send more than one follow-up every 1 or 2 weeks. So just something to keep in mind. And then finally, like Dr. Balsam said, if you can, seek funding to try and provide additional financial incentives. People are going through a lot economically, and to ask them to give you any more time to research without being able to compensate them could be a very tough ask right now. So try to see if there are small pots of funding, whether they're dissertation grants or smaller awards through your department, that you can use to compensate participants for their time. I've included a small section here on alternatives to data collection. If you're having a hard time collecting data, you are not alone. There are a number of free and open databases that are available. So make sure you're looking out for those, or even just Googling to see if there are repositories that you can access that are free. You might also consider contacting researchers in your specific field. When I wasn't sure initially whether or not I was going to go on with data collection, I actually contacted a number of Cushing's disease researchers to say, hey, do you have the data that might answer these specific questions that I'm interested in? If so, would you be willing to share it with me? I'm a doctoral student. I have limited resources, but I'd be more than happy to add you as an author, and to give you as much credibility, sort of reward, or not necessarily reward, but I'd give you the credit for sure for your data. So think of creative ways in which you can collect data or continue your dissertation that doesn't necessarily involve having to collect data itself. There are also other options for research if you're worried about your research being stalled at this time. So you could do literature reviews and meta-analyses or case studies. There are definitely ways to remain engaged in research even if your originally planned track has been suspended or has been halted. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on this last slide, there are just, like I said, a couple of resources for you to look into. So the APAGS homepage has a number of helpful guides for a lot of things, including how to defend your thesis or dissertation from home. I know that was one of the Staying on Track webinars as well. So if you haven't watched that, feel free to check that out. And then, of course, the discussion forum that I mentioned, and the ANST resources for neuropsychology trainees. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was very informative. Next, we have Dr. Teresa Ober, and I'm going to load up your slides, and you may begin when you're ready.
All right, great. Thank you. So nice to be joining you all today. My name is Teresa Ober, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to try to provide some ideas for adapting your research in response to the limitations of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, I'll be speaking from my perspective as a newly minted PhD. And because the focus of the presentation is really around promoting adaptation and resilience, I promise that I'll try to avoid using words like unprecedented, widespread, and devastating, even though I'm sure it's on everyone's mind. Next slide, please. So quickly, who am I? For the past year, I've been a postdoctoral research associate in the Learning Analytics and Measurement in Behavioral Sciences Lab at the University of Notre Dame. Before that, I was a doctoral student in educational psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. While at the Grad Center, my research focused on associations between executive functions and literacy development. And as a doctoral student, I also served as the chair of the Graduate Student Teaching Association of the Society for the Teaching of Psychology and as an administrative assistant to the APA at the UN. Now working in the Learning Analytics lab, my current research focuses on cognitive and non-cognitive factors that influence student achievement. I'm particularly interested in topics related to assessment, as well as methodological and practical advances in understanding how digital log data can be triangulated with more traditional self-report methods that study constructs associated with learning, such as student engagement. And so working in a lab that focuses on psychometrics and comparing that with my experience in grad school gives me a certain perspectives on factors of your research that might buffer against the impact of limitations imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So I guess as an educational psychologist, instead of giving answers, I like to ask more questions. Specifically, these are questions that I think are helpful for any researcher to ask themselves as they're thinking about how to make modifications to their research plan in light of the pandemic. The questions generally, map onto sort of what phase of your research that particular project is in. So did you already have a research question in mind before the COVID-19 pandemic? Did you already develop a research design or method of data collection? Did you already start data collection before the COVID-19 pandemic? And is your study ongoing and longitudinal? I think as Dr. Balsam and Mary very kind of aptly touched on, longitudinal research is obviously going to be a little bit more complicated. I'll talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So maybe you've already started data collection. Well, what should you do? As Mary and Dr. Balsam mentioned, you could always administer and assess another instrument that specifically asks about COVID-19 related experiences, or even conduct an interview if you, for example, have a smaller sample size that captures information about how your participants have experienced the pandemic. If it's part of an ongoing you might also, depending on your sample size, you might also consider, analyzing your data such that you have sort of a pre and post COVID-19 era. I know it's kind of premature to start talking about it as a post COVID-19 era, but it at least allows you to make sure that, you're not overlooking confounding variables that might be related to the pandemic rather than directly related to your study. So in my own experience, working on a project that involved data collection through an online computerized assessment in the spring 2020 semester, we were fortunate in the sense that high school students enrolled could still complete the study online from home. Nevertheless, we were obviously really worried about the quality of online instruction among so many other factors that could have affected their performance in this particular study. And so we were able to adapt the protocol. Luckily, Notre Dame has a pretty quick IRB turnaround, and administer to scale, trying to capture some information about their perceptions of the instructional discontinuity that they may have experienced that semester. Since the study also involved estimation of item parameters based on their performance, there was an ongoing discussion about whether or not we should actually use the responses kind of post mid-March, because there may be reasons to think that students' performance would be compromised. As much as I don't like, throwing data away or, putting a project on the back burner, there has been at least one case where I had to do so simply because I was worried about some of the confounds that the COVID-19 pandemic might have introduced. This was a project specifically looking at students' sort of self-assessments of their performance on an AP exam, and because the AP obviously courses were moved online, the entire AP was moved online, and the format had changed. It's a study that, at least for now, I've had to sort of scrap, but hopefully I'll be able to return to it. Next slide, please. So maybe you've already started data collection and you're doing a longitudinal study. As I mentioned, I think that it can get a little bit more complicated in a case like this. On the one hand, a high impact event like COVID-19 unfolding as it did was probably not something that you would expect any researcher to reasonably have anticipated. But on the other hand, this is really an opportunity for researchers who conduct longitudinal studies to contribute to a better understanding of how certain populations have been affected. If these studies are done well, they could actually really be helpful in charting a course towards promoting resilience among certain populations to the impact of COVID-19. And so from speaking with colleagues who do a lot of longitudinal research, particularly in clinical or developmental psychology, here are some things that I've heard as suggestions. Of course, collaborating with other researchers, maybe people who study a similar topic longitudinally, and possibly coordinating an effort to administer a similar set of scales, just to see, how well your participant sample sort of maps onto the experiences of others. I would also recommend, as soon as possible, trying to conduct some sort of attrition analysis. If you're not able, not successful in having follow-up, like Mary suggested, with participants, to see if maybe certain populations are, certain members of certain populations are dropping out more than others. Importantly, I think it's really key to consider community-specific impacts of COVID-19 during data collection, not just with respect to the location, but also with respect to the temporality, right? So for example, we're seeing some hotspots now that maybe hadn't been in early spring and vice versa. You might also want to consider thinking about whether or not certain statistical techniques might shed light on, pandemic-related experiences. So for example, maybe learning a new methodological or analytic technique, such as like change point analysis, if your data is appropriate for something like that. In my own experience, and in collaborating with colleagues at CUNY, we actually examined attrition as an outcome rather than part of sort of the preliminary analysis of a study, where we were looking at whether or not students enrolled in an undergraduate course in the spring 2020 semester, were more likely to have kind of dropped out from submitting their homework than in previous semesters. And luckily, we had historical data to look at this type of information. So we actually turned that into a research opportunity, and one which we hope might actually inform instructors about how to react sensitively if they're noticing that certain students seem to be more impacted by the pandemic than in previous semesters. Next slide, please. So maybe you've already planned a study, but you haven't yet collected data. Well, this is a really good time to ask whether or not you can still pursue the research that you designed. I think Mary did a really great job of talking about how she was able to adapt her study and making the necessary amendments to the IRB protocol just to make sure that everything's safe for both the researchers as well as the participants. If you haven't collected data but have already planned the study, it might also be a good idea to reevaluate whether or not your study is sort of appropriate given the research context. It might be a chance to ask new questions that are specifically related to the experience that people are having because of the COVID-19 pandemic, as Dr. Balsam, I think, nicely said. So for example, as an educational psychologist, I'm used to conducting research in schools, and given that many school districts have adopted online teaching or some sort of hybrid teaching, let alone they're probably not so eager to have another researcher in the classroom, that type of research can become quite difficult. And so if it's not possible to sort of conduct research face-to-face, there are of course other options. And I think Mary touched on this as well. So for example, maybe you have unfinished writing projects, or you've always wanted to apply for a grant to seek extra funds to conduct your research. This might be a good opportunity to do that. You might also ask yourself, like, how can my research on this particular topic contribute to an understanding of the psychological impact of COVID-19 by adding new measures and changing your protocol slightly. So in my own experience, prior to the pandemic, I've been setting up an experimental study on computerized adaptive testing, and we intended to recruit participants on campus. But because of the pandemic and the difficulties in having participants in the lab, we've been fortunate to transition that study fully online, and we're able to get an IRB amendment to be able to do so. but even if you're able to transition a study online, it's useful to think ahead about some of the administrative aspects, like participant recruitment. I've also been finding that participant compensation, just paying participants via electronic gift card, still requires coordination with certain offices on campus. And because people are working at home, that becomes additionally challenging because they might not be as responsive or accessible. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, if you haven't started a study and you haven't finished really designing it, but you're starting to think about a possible set of research questions, now is a really good time to sort of look into the institutional guidelines for safe study administration. Normally, you might be able to rely a little bit on colleagues or other grad students in your cohort or advanced grad students to give you some of this guidance, but you might actually find that they're just as unfamiliar with some of the new guidelines as you are. So definitely take initiative to learn more about that. On my own lab, for example, we are resuming on-campus instruction, but we've had to submit a lab reopening plan just to allow researchers to physically be on campus, not even to allow participants to be on campus. I also just want to emphasize, and I think both Mary and Dr. Balsam have done a nice job of doing this as well, that despite the challenges of conducting research in the current context, there are still many, many opportunities for your research, particularly in social and behavioral science, to really contribute to an understanding of the psychological impact that COVID-19 is having. Even among people who are not, thought to be particularly vulnerable to the virus, right? Like obviously, I'm thinking of particularly youth who are now, resuming instruction in a fully online context. So we're still kind of reeling and understanding the impact of this pandemic, and now is a good time to really do some high impact research that helps us form an understanding of it. I think I've already, next slide, please. So I think I've already touched on some of these things here. I also just want to emphasize that, if you're a quantitative researcher, now might be a really good time to learn how to do qualitative research, particularly if you have a smaller sample size, by conducting interviews online. Just as this webinar is being recorded and transcribed, so you can also do the same with like Zoom interviews. And so the transcription process saves quite a lot of time and allows you rich information to analyze. In our lab, we recently conducted interviews with teachers who had been involved in the project in the spring to try to understand a little bit more about their experience, and have submitted that up for a conference presentation. I also want to mention that certain organizations, like I'm thinking of NCME, that's the National Council on Measurement in Education, or AERA, the American Educational Research Association, have a lot of online trainings to teach new methods and new analytic skills, some of which are actually free. The ICPSR is another great resource if you're interested in doing secondary data analysis, and they also have trainings for how to hit the ground running in terms of analyzing some of the data they have available. I also want to emphasize, as I think Dr. Balsam and Mary have done so as well, that this is an opportunity to consider new topics and future collaborations that you might want to have in the future. So if anything, it is an opportunity to kind of reflect as you think about, charting the course ahead in your research. Next slide, please. So this is basically a summary of the presentation. I think it's really just helpful if you're planning to download it later. And on the next slide, I just have some references and resources. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ober. That was very informative. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Bridget Callahan. I'm so glad you made it. So let's get started. Here you go. Bridget, you have to unmute yourself. There you go. Bridget? Don't think we can hear you. Are you sure that you have your audio on computer audio? Yeah, we can't hear you, Bridget. The top panel of the window should say computer audio, and you have to make sure that every icon that shows a microphone should be green. Okay, well, That's okay. I'm sorry, Bridget, we can't hear you. If you can resolve it, we'll take a good listen to your talk. Otherwise, we have these wonderful slides, and I'm just going to scroll through them real quickly and get to the very end, which will be our Q&A. So Bridget has the Brain and Body Lab at UCLA. Go ahead and give that a good look. I think it's a really good website. And so with that, let's proceed with our Q&A session. We have about 4 minutes left, and we got a lot of questions for our panelists. One question asks, it has more to do with just conducting research during such a stressful time, and that this is stress that both research participants and researchers are feeling. How have you been able to refocus your own attention on research projects and mitigate your own personal stress due to the pandemic? Can anyone of our panelists answer that question?
Yeah, this is Kimberly Balsam, and I think I really validate that. I think, one of the effects of stress that a lot of people, myself included, are feeling is that it's hard. It can be hard to focus. I think the cognitive load of everything that we're having to deal with is difficult. For me, adding in a focus on COVID-19 to my research got me energized and made it feel more relevant. So I think that was helpful. Another thing that I've done is just join and work with a number of different accountability groups, whether it's working with people from my lab or I'm in a writing accountability group that's meeting 5 minutes from now. Also I've had sort of Zoom sessions of, half-hour stretches or hour-long stretches where I work on writing with other people on Zoom, and then we check in before and afterwards. So just giving some structure things, the work-life balance is really out of whack right now, and even differences between work and home and lab and home, and figuring out how to give it some structure, I think, can help. But also just being nice to yourself and not buying into this myth that we're supposed to suddenly somehow be more productive right now, because that's not the case for most people.
Yes,
And
absolutely. Absolutely. Was that you, Mary, or
yes,
Teresa?
I was Mary. I was just going
Mary.
to add to that to say, for any graduate students listening too, I just want to say it's okay for you to not be as productive as you would like, or to not, to give yourself a break. And I think, there's a lot of pressure, like Dr. Balsam sort of was mentioning, to be publishing more right now, or to be working on projects that you haven't had a chance to attend to. But it's fine if you can't do that as well. And really, I think, reach out to your other peers or to any mentors that you have for support as well, and lean on them as much as you can, because everyone's in the same boat. We're all managing the same stressors. So it's okay to cut yourself some slack and to not feel the pressure all the time.
Yeah, I agree with those points. I also just want to add that I think it's helpful, since you don't sort of have the accountability of working side by side with, your colleagues or your lab mates or whatever, to try to like build more structure into your day. I find that helps me be a little bit more productive, but I also try not to beat myself up over, not getting as much writing done in a day as I had hoped. Yeah, I do think that having kind of a structure and knowing how I want to spend, a few hours each day is really, really key.
Yes, absolutely. I think those are good good recommendations. We also got a lot of questions regarding ethics. So here's a more broad general one. It asks, how far can a method be modified without difficulties with ethics, confidentiality, validity, and research objective? Um, it's kind of a broad question, and then there were more specific ones that talked about the ethics of using platforms like Zoom in terms of privacy and confidentiality. Can you speak a little bit about these issues?
I think the first question is a really complicated one. I guess you sort of every time you revise even like an item on a Likert type scale, you don't really know how it's going to change the measurement properties of the instrument. I guess speaking from kind of my own experience, it seems like it's safer to maybe add in a few items if you're not too concerned about participant fatigue from taking a very lengthy survey, rather than completely revising every single item on a survey, particularly if you want to be able to compare it with data that you've collected prior to the pandemic. So at least that is something that we have certainly done in trying to capture at least one dimension of how participants would be affected by the pandemic. In this case, instructional discontinuity, but arguably there could be any number of other factors that we could have tried evaluating, given the current context. So I think first, figuring out kind of how the pandemic is likely to have affected your participants in a way that would affect your study, and maybe consider adding in a few items at the end rather than completely revising a survey. But I think Mary also mentioned that there are some measures that have been validated already, and so that might be something to look into as well, using measures that have already been developed.
I think we have time for one last question, and this one is an interesting one. Do you think these new methods for collecting data will be something we adopt long-term, even after COVID-19 is no longer with us, if you can imagine that day? What do you think research methods will look like in, say, 3 years and beyond?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'll just be very quick. This is Mary. I sure hope that we do maintain some of these creative ways that we've found to adapt long term. At least being a neuropsychology trainee, I've been wanting for neuropsychology to move into the space of digital or computerized testing for a long time. So I'm really happy that we're getting there, and I hope that we can continue to build on it and maintain it long term.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. I think this is really a broader social question about what things really do work online or, over Zoom on the phone versus what things really do call for us to be in person. And I think that, time will tell, but I do think that to some extent, what we do as psychological researchers is going to be transformed in a lot of different ways.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I wish we had another 30 minutes. It went by very quickly, but I want to thank our guests for taking the time to speak with us today. And I want to thank our audience members for taking the time to tune in. Be sure to visit our Staying on Track webpage to see what other webinars are coming up in the series. And that concludes our webinar. So many thanks to everyone for being here today. Have a wonderful day, and of course, stay safe out there. Bye-bye.